Paul George has been at the center of two of the most interesting and long-lasting trades in the modern history of the NBA. And based off the title of this video, you might be wondering which trade we're going to be talking about. Is it when he went to the Clippers? Is it when he went to OKC? We're actually going to do both. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to combine both of these trades together so that we know what happened to every single piece from both of the Paul George trades. Really quickly though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Prize Picks. As I mentioned last week, with everybody's bracket challenges going on right now, this is a great time to get into Prize Picks. Now, if you've never done Prize Picks before, essentially it is you against these numbers. You can see the numbers behind me. Prize Picks will put up numbers for any kind of combination of statistics you can possibly think about, whether it be with your bracket challenges, whether it be with the NBA, points, assists, rebounds, steals, turnovers, three-pointers, blocks, all different kinds of things. They will put up these numbers. You pick between 2 and 6 players, and if you get them correct, you win some cash. So for example, you can see me making some selections here behind me. If I were to get these correct, again, anywhere between 2 and 6, you pick more or less for each of these numbers. That's worth mentioning as well. And if you get it correct, you win some cash. Now, something you can do right now as well, if you want to get into this, you can click the link in the description. You can use code SPORTING for a 100% deposit match up to $100. Again, that can be with your bracket challenge stuff. That can be with the NBA. You can mix and match with all kinds of other sports. There's plenty of options over there in Prize Picks, and now is a great time as well. You pick more or less. You pick between 2 and 6 players and potentially win some cash. And you can use that code SPORTING as well as click the link in the description to get a 100% deposit match up to $100 right now. And thank you again to Prize Picks for sponsoring this video. Let's begin with 2017 when Paul George gets traded from the Indiana Pacers to the Oklahoma City Thunder. He told Indiana that he was going to leave as a free agent, that there was no reason to keep him, and that they should go ahead and trade him and get value in exchange. At the time, it was assumed that he would end up in LA as a Laker in that following offseason, so his market was relatively limited for teams that didn't want to take the risk on a possible rental. Ultimately, a trade that everybody hated at the time went down, and that is Oklahoma City sending Domantas Sabonis and Victor Oladipo to Indiana in exchange for Paul George. And the interesting thing about this, not only is the fact that everybody hated the deal at the time, but also that this worked out incredibly well for Indiana, not just in an immediate sense because both Sabonis and Oladipo were very good for them, but as well as in the long term for what they got in exchange for both of those players. Now, Sabonis at the time, we didn't really know a whole lot about because he had been recently drafted. He had one weird Oklahoma City season where he had to shoot threes basically to space around Russell Westbrook. Definitely still a project at the time. And Oladipo, despite being the former 2nd overall pick in the draft, one of the weaker drafts we've seen in modern NBA history, hadn't quite found a full-time role as a real star at the NBA level, and so a lot of people did not like this deal. Ultimately, this works out really, really well for Indiana. Oladipo and Sabonis both have really good seasons. Oladipo becomes an all-NBA caliber guy for one season. Unfortunately, injuries and then an eventual trade ruined his tenure in Indiana, but for one full season, Victor Oladipo was a legitimate all-NBA caliber player, and Sabonis, of course, was a multiple-time All-Star as well, and someone that really elevated that team. They didn't have a ton of postseason success, but certainly made Indiana relevant. Now, in the long term, what do these players end up becoming for Indiana? So Oladipo, after a couple of seasons, ends up getting traded as a part of the James Harden to Brooklyn deal. Essentially, it's a straight up swap where Oladipo goes to Houston and Indiana gets Caris LeVert in exchange. And initially, Caris LeVert is fine, tries to add to kind of the young group they're putting together in Indiana, but the fit just was not there. So then he later gets traded to Cleveland in exchange for what would be a lottery protected first round pick in 2022, which was not conveyed and is now a 2023 first round pick, in addition to a couple of second round picks, one of which becomes Andrew Nembhard, who is a relatively important piece of the current Pacers roster. And then in terms of Sabonis, I mentioned that he was a very good player for Indiana. They ultimately move him in exchange for Tyrese Halliburton and Buddy Hield, essentially, to Sacramento. They also get Tristan Thompson, but they waive him. And if you've watched any of my videos in the past, you know how I feel about this deal. Halliburton has been incredible for them. Borderline all-NBA caliber guy if he'd played enough games this season, and just an unbelievable asset for Indiana to have moving forward. So what does this Paul George trade now read as in 2023? Essentially, it goes like this. Paul George to Oklahoma City in exchange for Tyrese Halliburton, Buddy Hield, Andrew Nembhard, and a future 2023 first from Cleveland that is probably going to convey somewhere around the 20th pick, which on the surface is a pretty good haul for Indiana, but we all know that Paul George to Oklahoma City is not really how this trade reads in 2023. And that is because we now have to deal with the other Paul George trade, and that is in 2019. Paul George ending up with the LA Clippers, one of the most surprising moves in the modern history of the league. I can specifically remember because it happened overnight. I can remember waking up and looking at my phone and being being like, how in the world is Paul George in LA? How is he a Clipper? Because he had just signed this extension the year prior with Oklahoma City. It was assumed that him and Russ were going to continue to run it back. And then once it became clear that the Clippers could get Kawhi if they traded for Paul George, they were willing to trade literally everything in order to get this guy. At the time of the trade in 2019, this is how the Paul George trade read to LA. LA gets Paul George in exchange for Danilo Gallinari, SGA, a Miami 2021 first, a Clippers 2022 first, a Clippers 2023 pick swap, a Clippers 2024 first, a Clippers 2025 pick swap, and then later on, there was also added a protected Miami 2025 first. Initially, it was 23, then they switched it to 25, and that is lottery protected in 2025. Oh yeah, and a Clippers 2026 first round pick. So essentially, every pick and pick swap that the Clippers could throw in there, in addition to 2 Miami picks that they also had access to, in addition to SGA, in addition to Danilo Gallinari, going to Oklahoma City in exchange for Paul George, and basically the right to sign Kawhi Leonard as well. Now, my opinion on that deal at the time as well as now is pretty much the exact same. I pushed back on this a little bit more in the moment than I think most people did because I recognized the injury concerns with both Paul George and Kawhi, both of them coming off of significant surgeries in that offseason. And although the combination of them two together, arguably in a couple of different seasons, could have led to a title, I think going into the bubble, they were the best team in the league and they just did not handle the bubble well. And I think there are situations where Kawhi gets hurt in the postseason where if he was healthy, for example, the year that the Clippers made the conference finals, I think they could have contended for a title in those years as well. And that ceiling exists as well as the floor of injury issues and possibly trading away all these future picks for guys that actually don't play a ton of games. And I think overall, we've seen that be the case with this deal over time. Now for OKC, we'll begin with Danilo Gallinari. Essentially, he gets moved later on to Atlanta for 2 future seconds. Not a ton of assets there in exchange for Gallinari, but he was decent for Oklahoma City there for a little bit. SGA completely changes how this deal looks. If SGA just becomes like a decent starting level guard, then you're really heavily relying on some draft picks, some of which that Oklahoma City has already hit on, which we're going to talk about later. But him becoming arguably one of the best guards in the entire league, he's certainly going to make an All-NBA team this year, and someone that you can continue to build your team around moving forward. Cannot be overstated how important that is to this deal and to Oklahoma City in this situation. In terms of the draft picks, 2021, they get Tre Mann, who is interesting, but I'm not sure the ceiling is there other than just like a pretty high level scorer kind of guy. Like I think his ceiling is somewhere like the Jordan Poole, Tyler Hero range if he ever gets there, but he's still an interesting player. But here's the big one. 2022, that pick ends up becoming Jalen Williams, and that's J-Dub Jalen Williams. That's the 12th overall pick in the 2022 NBA draft, and he is one of the most interesting rookies in this class, arguably has been the second best rookie in this class for the entirety of the season, and is a real contender to try and steal the Rookie of the Year award away from Paolo Banchero, and an unbelievable piece for them moving forward. Someone that they really needed, someone that can handle the ball a little bit, can play on the wing, brings them great size, energy, effort, fits in incredibly well with this Oklahoma City team alongside SGA as well as Josh Giddey, who they didn't get in this trade, but they got kind of because of the trade because they made their team so much worse. And that's the extent of the picks that they've used to this point. But as I mentioned earlier, they have all of these future first round picks, whether it be picks or pick swaps between both Miami and the Clippers. Again, to revisit those specifically, it's pick swaps for the Clippers in 2023 and 2025. It's outright unprotected firsts from the Clippers in 2024 and 2026, and then that Miami lottery protected first in 2025. And here's where we put both of these trades together. This is what I think is really cool about these kinds of videos. How does the Paul George trade, both 2017 and 2019, look right now? It's obviously a 3-way deal, and as of now, it reads: Paul George to the Clippers. The Thunder get SGA, Tre Mann, Jalen Williams, 2 future seconds, a 2023 and 2025 Clippers pick swap, 2024 and 2026 Clippers first round picks, and that Miami first in 2025 that's lottery protected. And the Pacers get Tyrese Haliburton, Buddy Hield, Andrew Nembhard, a 2023 Cleveland first, and a future second if you want to throw the Kings in there as well. The Kings get Domantas Sabonis. And what is by far most interesting to me about all that and reading that is this kind of worked out for every single team, both that traded for Paul George as well as traded away Paul George. In hindsight, that first Indiana trade is one of the very rare true win-win trades for both teams, both in the moment for Indiana because they got guys in Sabonis and Oladipo that initially at least wanted to be there. They saw some level of success. They didn't completely bottom out. Both those guys were young, continued to improve, and they got better value than I think anybody could have possibly imagined at the time that they traded Paul George away. And then as well as in the long term by making another smart deal and getting Haliburton in exchange for Sabonis as well as some extra value for Oladipo with LeVert and then ultimately the first from Cleveland. And then for the Thunder, I've made this case before, like the Paul George trade initially was a huge risk. The fact that he re-signed really helped them. And then the most beneficial thing I think that could have happened for their franchise was when the Clippers asked for Paul George and that he requested a trade specifically to the Clippers. And then they got rid of Russ as well because they didn't really have that much of a future. They tried the Carmelo thing. They kept trying to try all these different variations additions to the roster, none of which were going to get them past the first round, maybe the second round of the postseason, and they were going to just continue to run that back. But their franchise is in such a better position now as a result of not only acquiring and then re-signing Paul George in the first place, but also being forced to get rid of both him as well as Russ, and now creating what I think is the team with one of, if not the brightest futures in the entire league. And that's because of the decision they made to get rid of Paul George. They didn't have to do it. They just ended up doing it, but they didn't have to. They had this guy under contract for multiple seasons, but they seized that opportunity. They also get value for Russ. SGA becomes an all-NBA caliber player, and it is an incredible thing to look back on. The impact that Paul George has had, not on a championship level yet, we'll get to the Clippers here in a second, but an incredible just ripple effect of wherever Paul George goes in the league, and then where those pieces then end up afterwards that you get initially in either of these Paul George trades. However, where I land at the end of the day is this. When you look at all three of these teams, when you look at Indiana, when you look at Oklahoma City, when you look at the Clippers, and you compare, even if it hasn't happened, on each level during each season, which of these teams now and moving forward have the best opportunity to truly, at a high level, compete for a title, I still would argue that if things went a little bit differently for the Clippers over the prior few seasons, they would have made a finals, maybe won a title, and certainly gave themselves the best championship odds out of any of these three teams over the last few seasons, and arguably over the next few, depending on the health and longevity of both Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. And ultimately, that's the name of the game. Like, you can make smart moves, you can look like an interesting team, you can win 48 games like Indiana, you can have a bright future like Oklahoma City, but the name of the game, if you're an NBA team, is to try and win a title. And ultimately, of these three teams, the Clippers have put themselves in a best position to do that out of any of the three. Things can still go very, very wrong. They can give up an incredible pick in 2026 unprotected to the Thunder. And obviously in the long term, the Thunder, not only with their young players, but also their picks. Chet Holmgren hasn't even played for them yet. Jalen Williams has looked incredible as a rookie. I love Giddey. I love SGA. And I love all the picks and futures that they have. But if things went a little bit differently, I think the Clippers certainly could have succeeded in a really big way as a result of these trades. And I don't think that we're quite at the end of what this era could look like for the Clippers if they get some better health moving forward. That's still a big if, but I don't want to just make it seem like the Clippers completely lost this. Out of these three teams, I think every single team won in kind of their own individual way.